Welcome to a presentation by Grizzly Times. This one devoted to grizzly bears in the Cabinet-Yaak Ecosystem of far northwestern Montana. My name is David Matson. I'm one of two co-founders of Grizzly Times and a lifelong student of grizzly bears. Going back to my early experiences studying these animals in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem between 1979 and 1993. The two populations of grizzly bears featured here that occupy the Cabinet-Yaak ecosystem are among the smallest and most endangered of any in the contiguous United States. So the upshot is that the challenges of recovery are truly daunting, but the potential rewards are likewise substantial. Unlike some researchers, I have not spent a career studying grizzlies in this ecosystem. But I hope to provide here something you certainly will not read in a government report and probably not hear from any agency biologist, which is a comprehensive, integrated look at the history, the current plight, and future potential of Cabinet-Yaak grizzlies, all of which is relevant, if not essential, to understanding why these bears are so endangered and what it will take to recover them. In total, the presentation is a little over 1 hour long, which is why I've divided it into 5 sections or episodes, each one building on the one that comes before it. So, welcome to Fractures and Hubs, a story about grizzly bears in the Yaak region and Cabinet Mountains of northwestern Montana. So as is my wont, I'm going to try to probably cover too much ground in too little time, which necessitates some sort of a roadmap for you to anticipate where I'm going, have an understanding of the arc of the presentation spanning all 5 of the segments. I'm going to start with history. First of all, how and when grizzlies got onto this continent and into this part of the world, followed by subsequent history then of extirpations, which was associated with arrival of Europeans, then drill into regional history a bit, and then look at the legacy of this history, which is fragmentation of populations. And after that, then start looking at specific causes of death and the reasons why grizzly bears die ultimately determines the fates of grizzly bear populations, including the ones in the Cabinet-Yaak. And after laying that foundation, then look at what has likely been happening in terms of status and trend of grizzly bears in the Cabinet-Yaak ecosystem. Then move on to looking at the current potential, as well as the threats that grizzly bears face here, and related to that, the uncertainties and problems that are promised by the future, the near-term future. But then end on a more positive note, featuring what I'm calling a metavision, which is a picture of what is possible, and indeed there is lots of potential. There are grounds for optimism, and the Cabinet-Yaak grizzly bear is playing a key part in realizing that potential. So ending then with more specifically how we get there. So starting with when and how grizzly bears arrived at mid-latitudes on North America, it requires going back to the Ice Age. So specifically the Wisconsin, which is what geologists call the last Ice Age, the early part of that Ice Age, 70 to 55,000 years ago. Here what you're looking at in this map is North America tilted downward towards the bottom. So correspondingly, these arrows are pointing toward the North Pole. Everything in white in this map and the couple of maps to follow is ice sheet at the time. The Cordilleran ice sheet to the west, the Laurentide ice sheet to the east. Towards the top, you can see Eastern Asia peeking in, joined at that time to North America by Beringia, which was a landmass exposed because of lower ocean levels. That water caught up in the continental ice sheets. So we ended up then with one giant supercontinent comprised of Eurasia and North America. I've also shown on there a vegetation formation unique to that time called steppe tundra. But this period of time is important to the story because that's when grizzly bears first arrived in North America and eastern Beringia, comprised of 3 different genetic lineages, clades 2, 3, and 4. You can think of a clade as approximately a subspecies. It was about this time as well that we had these fleeting ice-free corridors opening up between the ice sheets, and it was through one of these then that grizzly bears slipped south to mid-latitudes, the only lineage to survive at mid-latitudes being clade 4 grizzly bears. And shortly after these clade 4 bears arrived, the door literally and figuratively slammed shut with coalescence of the continental ice sheets. Meanwhile, interestingly enough, grizzly bears in eastern Beringia went extinct for reasons that are logically the topic of an entirely different presentation, but nonetheless, they went away. Fast forward then to the early part of the current warm epoch, about 11,500 years ago. At that time, the ice sheets were in rapid retreat. There was an ice-free corridor that was rapidly enlarging. And at this time, grizzly bears dispersing out of central Siberia recolonized eastern Beringia, moving south then into this ice-free corridor. At the same time, our clade 4 grizzly bears moved north. They met and mixed then in what was to become central Alberta. But importantly, clade 3 grizzly bears never got further south. The upshot is that all of the bears that we did have, we continue to have at mid-latitudes in North America, are clade 4 bears, that first wave of colonizing grizzly bears from Asia. And importantly, clade 4 grizzly bears have gone extinct everywhere else on Earth except for a small isolate on the island of Hokkaido in Japan. So what one could conclude from that is that our bears here are special, unique, and of a clade, it turns out, that is globally endangered. So this is how things sorted out about 2,000 years ago. After some waxing and waning in the distribution of grizzly bears, differentiated the distribution of clade 3 bears and clade 4 bears. So prior to the time of European arrival, we probably had around 80,000 grizzly bears just in the contiguous U.S. Which brings me then to the arrival of Europeans and the ensuing ecological holocaust. I don't think there's any other way you can characterize it, during which all sorts of animals were diminished or disappeared altogether, including grizzly bears. So here in green is where I reconstruct that we had grizzly bears in the contiguous U.S. about the time they were first encountering significant numbers of Europeans, about 1800. 50 years after that, grizzly bears were extirpated from roughly 10% of their former distribution, everything in yellow, gone largely from the central and southern plains. Years after that, they had disappeared from in excess of 90% of their former distribution, reduced to scattered small populations, denoted here by green. A lot of these small populations no more than a handful of bears at that time. 60 years after that, we had lost bears, grizzly bears, from 98% of the places where they once lived in the contiguous U.S., left in only 2% of their former distribution. So everything in green is where we had grizzly bears at around 1970. The lighter green denotes grizzly bear populations that went extinct prior to 1970, but notably, these were also larger populations in larger distributions. But what typifies these larger populations, unlike where grizzly bears survived, was the fact that these bears' ranges were highly lineated, which meant there was a lot of edge effect. So even though you have a large range, you have lots of opportunities for people to intrude on what would ostensibly be secure habitat. and so bears went extinct here as well. So grizzly bears left largely in the places where we still have them, the Northern Continental Divide, adjacent Cabinet-Yaak and Selkirks, Greater Yellowstone. A few bears hanging on in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, at least up to the 1970s, and a couple bears in the North Cascades. The reasons for this rapid loss of grizzly bears in a short period of time are pretty straightforward. It's because of Europeans armed with large caliber firearms, bad attitudes, informed by narratives such as manifest destiny, that at least in the minds of our European ancestors gave themselves permission to perpetrate genocides against bison, native peoples, wolves, grizzly bears. Giving rise then to this rather tedious montage of Europeans standing over or beside grizzly bears they had shot. Probably no more famous than Custer standing behind, in a classic trophy pose, the grizzly bear he shot in the Black Hills of South Dakota. So drilling in more specifically to what happened regionally, the Northern Rockies in particular, brings us to 1910 in this particular part of the world. And we happen to know where grizzly bears were about then, thanks to the assiduous efforts of a man named C. Hart Merriam, head of the National Biological Survey at that time. He was fanatical about collecting information on where we still had bears. So everywhere that's green here, shaded green, some small scattered populations. But by 1930 or thereabouts, this is what we had left. And we have a sense of the distribution then based on annual game reports that were produced by the National Forest Service, or by the Forest Service, during the 1920s, 1930s. And moreover, they produced estimates for various game populations, including grizzly bears. So for the first time, we have some sense of how many bears there were in each of these populations. So about 20 bears in the Selkirks, still 40 bears hanging on in the Clearwater country, about 530 bears in the Northern Continental Divide, 30 bears in the Yaak, and about 25 bears in the Cabinets. Not that much different than what we have now. Bringing us then to the 1970s, which is when grizzly bears in the contiguous U.S. Got Endangered Species Act protections. So with those protections over a period of 40 years, we've seen a pretty substantial increase in distribution. In terms of population estimates, roughly 850 bears in the Northern Continental Divide, between 700 and 900 in Greater Yellowstone. The numbers in red are what we probably had during the decades prior to or at the time of ESA protections. So significant gains, substantial gains in the Yellowstone ecosystem. In contrast, this is the status of things in the smaller ecosystems or populations to the west. Virtually no gains. In fact, losses. We lost all the bears we once had in the Clearwater. 40 bears now in Selkirks versus 20 in the 1930s, and just about the same number of bears now as we had in the 30s in the Yaak and the Cabinets. But this begs the question of why things turned out differently in these smaller western populations compared to in the Northern Continental Divide and Greater Yellowstone. Which brings me then to the effects of a certain legacy of history, the legacy specifically of population fragmentation. And indeed, not only the populations in the contiguous U.S., but also in adjacent Canada are highly fragmented. Illustrative of that, in dark green, we have core grizzly bear distribution currently, light green peripheral distribution. Here are our populations. And here are the fracture zones that have resulted in the fragmentation of these populations. And we have a really good sense of the degree and location of these fracture zones, thanks largely to the work of Michael Proctor. So you can see the Yaak, Cabinet, and Selkirk populations are relatively small part of a series of very small fragmented populations that extend up into southeastern British Columbia. So focusing on the United States, the yak and cabinet populations, the coincide with where we have highest human population densities. And as you might guess, the darker the shade of orange into red and thence to blue, the higher the densities of people. And these zones of high human population density coincide with highway corridors. Specifically, highways 2 and highways 20, at least in the yak and cabinet ecosystems. But also with where we have major railways, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway to the north, Montana Rail Link to the south. And these railways matter if for no other reason than that we know that 3 grizzly bears have been killed during recent decades along Montana Rail Link because of train strikes. And this is a non-trivial number given how few bears there are in the cabinet population and correspondingly how few bears have died. So this represents actually a significant portion of that total mortality. Making this a little more concrete, here a picture of what grizzly bears are facing along one of these fracture zones immediately to the southwest of the Cabinet Mountains. Here we're looking at Noxon Rapids Reservoir. Montana Rail Link parallels that, as does Highway 200. We have Noxon to the north, Trout Creek to the south. Topography that funnels grizzly bears down into this series of barriers to their movement, not only impediments to them getting from one place to another, but also complicating their ability to survive. So you can see how then these kinds of fracture zones are a non-trivial impediment, barrier to bears getting from the cabinets to somewhere else or from the yak to the cabinets and vice versa.